Welcome to Philosophy15. I'm Scott Aikin.
I'm Robert Talisse.
We're the authors of Why We Argue and How We Should, A Guide to Political Disagreement in an Age of Unreason, now in second edition from Routledge. And Pragmatism, Pluralism, and the Nature of Philosophy, also from Routledge. Today we're going to talk about a problem that Rob has been thinking quite a lot about recently, the moral demands of democratic citizenship. Rob, tell us about the kind of the problem of how this shows up on our radar.
Sure. So, we're familiar, I think, with all the ways in which democracy is demanding, right? And it's common to see a democracy requires,
gotta watch the news all the time.
You gotta watch the news, too many meetings. We have to do a lot if we're going to do our job as democratic citizens. We have to invest a lot of time and effort, energy into thinking, learning about, talking about political affairs.
Yeah.
And
so there's a lot of deliberating. There's a lot of staying up on stuff. There's a lot of knowing about what other people think and counting votes.
There's all of that,
okay.
Campaigning and fundraising and all that. There's a broad literature that's both on the democratic side and the sort of skeptical of democracy side that, says, look, this is it's even just practically too demanding.
Yeah.
Some even say it's cognitively too demanding, right? There's just no way for people to stay informed. It just requires too much cognitive bandwidth to do the work of a democratic citizen.
I can't even do my own taxes. How can I think of like what a good tax system looks like or something like that?
Good.
Can't balance my checkbook. How am I going to do that? So those are cognitive challenges.
Those are cognitive and sort of practical sort of demands of democracy, and democracy might be too demanding on either of those fronts. I myself don't think that it is. But what's less often, I think, noted is that democracy involves a pretty heavy moral demand. And it's this: in a democracy, being right about politics doesn't entitle anyone to get their way, right? So having the correct view about what the tax system should be like, what healthcare should be like, what the environmental policy should be like, what foreign policy, having the correct views.
So even if I solved all the cognitive stuff, I still have another problem.
That's right. It doesn't. Being
even if I was like, it's so hard to be right. Now I should just get what I want after that.
And being right doesn't entitle you to get your way. Okay. Not yet. That's another like
what?
Okay,
right,
good.
The being right just put me in charge.
Right, good. So in a democracy, being right doesn't entitle you to get your way, and in a democracy, your fellow citizens are your political equals. In fact, that is, one might think. And I happen to think that's the sort of defining feature of democracy: self-government among political equals. And so the moral demand of democracy runs that I have to regard, in some sense of that term, my fellow citizens as my political equals, even when I assess their views as wrong-headed, misguided, ignorant, and even unjust. So that's one face of the moral demand. The people who you assess as agents of or advocates for injustice are nonetheless your equals, which entails that they're entitled to an equal political say.
Even when they're wrong about everything?
Even when they're wrong about everything, even when they're wrong in blameworthy ways. Right?
Yeah.
It's not just that they're wrong because they're mistaken or like politics is hard. Even when they're wrong because they're willfully ignorant, they're depraved, they're benighted, they're wicked in some way. They like the bad, right? Or they're out only for themselves. Even when their views are wrong and on the side of injustice in a way that makes them culpable. Democracy requires that you regard them as your equals and therefore as equal citizens, which means they are entitled to an equal say. If you want to just put one sort of layer one more sort of boulder on the weight of this.
It's heavy already,
right?
man.
Yeah. Democracy also requires us to acknowledge that there are some conditions under which it's right for the government to enact injustice.
You mean they win?
When they
Sometimes they win.
Sometimes,
even when I'm right.
Sometimes the depraved people win out in the democratic process. When that happens, I have to at once see that as a defeat for justice, but nonetheless hold that it's right for the government to enact the will of those misguided, depraved, ignorant fellow citizens. So here's the moral burden that looks like it part of one way of sort of one face of the moral burden is to sort of think of it as sort of democratic citizenship involves a moral posture that often manifests as a crushing dilemma. My job as a democratic citizen is to advocate for, work for, stand up for justice.
Okay.
Good.
Yeah.
That's burdensome already.
That's hard enough.
Good. But I also have to recognize that my fellow citizens are my equals and therefore entitled to an equal political say, even when I assess them as promoters of injustice. And when they get their way, I have to think that it's
Justice
right
is still being
that
done.
it's right that there will be enacted.
Right.
Now, so that looks like it looks like an incoherent moral posture.
Yeah. So now I think that there's been one solution to this, which I think is, you might say, call it a false synthesis, to use some Hegelian jargon. Boom! Is Rousseau...
Is Hegelian jargon redundant?
I don't know.
Sorry, go ahead.
Not all jargon's Hegelian. So, right, okay. All right. So...
So you say Hegelese.
Hegelese, and a little Hegelese. And the false synthesis would be something that shows up like in Rousseau with the general will, which is that coming into the determination of the general will, whenever you find out what the general will is, you should change your mind, right?
Well, look,
so that's one way to solve the problem.
Is that a solution? That's not a solution.
Right,
not a solution.
Okay, right. Okay. That's as I said. That's a false synthesis, right? You've kind of got a kind of an antinomy here, and
that
so
removes the moral problem by imposing an impossible cognitive demand.
Right. If the cognitive demands are high. Yeah. Okay. All right. So that's one solution, but it looks like a bonkers solution. It looks like a cognitively, maybe a psychologically impossible one, and maybe one that would just say something like, look, that puts way too much power in the hands of, if you've got any of the worries that Plato and Socrates had about democracies, that they're not exactly reliable sources of their deliberative processes are not always reliable sources of good results. Going with that Rousseau strategy looks like it's a bad program. So, given the fact that we've got this tension and this strategy that we saw from Rousseau with the general will is not going to work, how exactly is this going to start showing up on our sort of radar? How's it going to give us certain kinds of deep moral conflicts?
Well, so let's note firstly that this sort of demand is not unconstrained, right?
Okay.
So the idea that I have to regard my fellow citizens as my equals, I have to regard them as entitled to an equal political say. There are some consolations in there, in that it's not unbounded. There are limits to what can count as, let's just call it, a valid democratic proposal. Right. Okay. So I need not.
So there are parameters.
There are parameters, right? So, some group of people who are advocating for wildly anti-democratic, unegalitarian policies, they pose, as Rawls says, a special problem, and we have to deal with them in some other ways. Yeah. I might still morally owe them certain things. Whether I have to regard them as my equals politically is a different kind of issue. Certainly don't have to respect them in certain ways, depending on how atrocious their moral positions are. Secondly, the second consolation, and this, by the way, runs counter to the Rousseauian attempt to sort of deal with this tension, is that it's part of democracy that after the votes are counted and you lose, and injustice prevails, you're still entitled to continue criticizing, advocating for the revisiting of, pressing, for, resisting, protesting the standing outcome. So we're never required as democratic citizens simply to submit to the democratic outcome.
Okay.
Right? We might be required to act in accordance with the law. We might be required to constrain our critical and protesting activities in particular ways, but we're never required merely to submit in silence to a democratic outcome. So it looks as if these are two ways in which, or two mechanisms by which, this moral demand to see my fellow citizens as my equals, even when I think that they're committed to injustice, and to see it as right for the government to enact their will when they win at the polls. These aren't we're not now rendered subordinates because there are constraints on what can rightfully be done in a democracy, even when it has majority support, and rights to continue protesting, criticizing, objecting, resisting are always going to be in place. Those, however, might not be...
That's not enough to... I mean, these are mitigating factors, right? So that we've got constitutions that you say, look, we don't do these things, right? So no matter how the majority votes, we're not just going to enslave a subpopulation or something like that. So we're not doing that. And then the second part is that no matter how bad things go for you at the polls, you still get to have your view, and you still get to promote your view, and you still get to make your case, even after you lose at the polls. We can always come back and revise our decisions. So those are one way is to say, well, there's going to be some injustice, but nothing. What David Estlund calls, there's going to be nothing that's scaldingly unjust, is what Estlund calls that. And then the second one is that you maintain your voice, you to maintain your freedom of conscience, that you get to keep your views and get to keep promoting it with the hopes that we come back and revise our vote or rethink it or something like that. But both of these sound like ways of not solving the problem, but in some ways finding ways to mitigate the tension.
Right, they dull the edge. But they might not dull the edge that much is the real worry.
Exactly.
Right? Because remember, let's just say, okay, so on the first constraint, not every view counts as a valid democratic option. So we just get rid of the Nazis and get rid of all the nutcases, right? Yep. Dangerous nutcases, to be sure. Get rid of them. That's a different kind of problem. It still remains the case that with respect to any important political matter like healthcare, there's going to be a range within the spectrum of acceptable, valid democratic opinion. There's going to be a range of views that conflict or oppose one another, and most of them are going to, many of them are going to be views that I will regard, given my own view about what should be done with respect to healthcare. Many of the opposing views are going to look to me like violations of justice, but they might get legitimately enacted by the democratic process. So I've still now got the tension, right?
Yeah.
I have to stand up for justice while at the same time admitting that under certain conditions, unjust options rightfully are enacted. The second consolation is pretty cold too, because remember, in a democracy, even when your side wins and you see that as a victory for justice, the agents for injustice, they still get to continue protesting.
Yeah, they don't
have to shut up either. Right?
Yeah, that's exactly
they don't.
Right?
They don't have to
stay on the air. Right? Yeah,
that's exactly right.
Yeah.
So it looks as if you're right. These are mitigating sort of. We are constraining the kinds of risks that we're taking, or maybe are constraining the sort of severity of the injustice. But it looks still as if democratic citizenship involves a moral demand, the requirement to recognize the equality of my fellow citizens even when they're on the side of injustice. So the moral demand that democratic citizenship imposes on us does look like it is the generator of a pretty severe, tragic moral dilemma, a conflict of conscience.
Yeah, that's right.
Where I have to promote or be complicit in
the things that make me me, the values I've got, it looks like are under attack in a democracy, given the way that we've set up and the agreements that we've got about what a just political order is supposed to be.
And maybe
that seems bonkers. Why did we agree to this?
Maybe it's an impossible moral demand.
Now we're going to try to solve it in the next one.
Philosophy 15, folks. See you later.